The House comes to questions for oral answer. Question number 1, in the name of the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
This question is to the Minister of Defence and asks, has the government given instructions to the Defence Force to begin preparations for deployment to the Middle East against ISIS?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, no, there's been no decision on any deployment to the Middle East beyond existing missions.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is he aware as Minister that soldiers from 2nd to 1st Battalion and 1 Battalion are in Waiouru right now, and that Defence have, quotes and using their words, made its own determination to prepare troops for a possible deployment to the Middle East, end of quotes? And if so, why would they do that?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr Speaker, post the discussions that took place in the House yesterday, I did ask that question of the Defence Force. They explained to me that in line with what they had previously stated, published by the Herald, I think, on Tuesday morning, that they were looking at matters that could not be done in a hurry if they were asked to answer the question. But no instruction has been issued, no decision has been made. No soldier should anticipate any deployment at all.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is it concerned that the Army would begin such large-scale preparations for war engagement, bringing together soldiers from across New Zealand, conduct annual weapons qualifications and laws of armed conflict training, feed and house those troops away from their home camps, size them up for expensive new body armour at great expense to the taxpayer, all without instructions from him to do so, and without informing the Army, without the Army informing him of what they're up to?
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, I'd be more worried if the Army was not engaging in training and simply lolling about the place, resting up, hoping nothing happened.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is it likely that the government will deploy a company-sized force of infantry to Iraq to combat ISIS, and if not, why is a company-sized infantry force being trained in Waiouru right now?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, despite the assertions of the Right Honourable Winston Peters, the government has ruled out engaging in combat in Iraq. Further, sir, we made it very clear that if we were to be engaged in the fight against ISIS, it would be on the basis of intelligence, humanitarian aid and capacity building for the Iraqi forces. All of those points were made in the Prime Minister's speech on the 5th of November, which I'm sure he's read.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is it not true that the Commander Joint Forces, the commander when our forces are deployed overseas, is now threatening soldiers training for Iraq that they will be charged if they talk to media or members of Parliament about the pre-deployment training they are currently conducting?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr Speaker, given that there is no decision to deploy troops to Iraq, I really can't comment on that. It's simply speculation, much like the ferry touched the bottom.
Well, it touched your bottom, yeah.
Order. Order. Order.
I can't explain.
Order. Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is it not a fact that he, as Minister, cancelled his planned visit with the Commander of Joint Forces to the troops currently undergoing training for Iraq so that he could deny any knowledge of the true preparations for war that are going on?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
No, Mr Speaker, that's absolutely incorrect. I was actually recently in Halifax and Washington with the Commander of Joint Forces, and tomorrow I will be at the Devonport Naval Base for a passing out parade for young naval ratings and officers.
Point of order, Speaker.
Point of order.
I didn't ask.
Order. Point of order. Right Honourable Winston
Speaker,
Peters.
I didn't ask about Halifax. I didn't ask about Devonport. I talked about the troops currently undergoing training for Iraq.
Order. Member resume his seat. The question started, is it not a fact? And the Minister immediately answered to say, no, it wasn't a fact. So, point of order.
My fact was to do with a specific locale or site.
Order. The members had plenty of time in this place. I'm on my feet. The member has had plenty of time to frame his questions. He started his question with, is it not a fact? And then went on about cancelling a visit. The minister, when he rose to his feet, said no. Effectively, he's saying it's not a fact. If the
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr Speaker, it is, of course, a very well-known fact that the Right Honourable Winston Peters has a lot of trouble understanding what no means.
And that's not a valid point of order.
Mr Speaker.
Order, is this a supplementary question?
No, Mr Speaker.
Order, then before the member starts, I just want to clarify, is the member in any way contesting a ruling I've just given, or is he raising a fresh point of order?
I'm raising a fresh point of order because the question that I sought to ask had to do with only one specific location, and I got two locations that were never referred to.
Order. I have ruled that the minister address the question. If the member has further supplementaries, he should use them. But to continue to relitigate once I have given a ruling will lead to disorder. Question number 2, the Honourable Annette King.